but it's not there. It's not there. It's not there, Jesus. It doesn't make any sense. And yet, everyone who's a believer thinks the opposite. That's because the believers are never told of these other things that existed. That's not their fault. They're only brought up with certain literature. They only know, like Muslims, as I say to you, only know the Quran. If they don't know that anything came before the Quran, and they don't know there's two stories of Joseph, one in the Quran and one in the Bible, and the one in the Quran is a derivative one that's inferior, well, if you say that to them, they're going to cut your throat. But that doesn't matter if they're angry or cut your throat. The point of the fact is it's true. The one in the Quran is derivative and inferior. And you say, well, then they'll say to you, you know not, God knoweth, you know not. Okay, that's a good answer, but it still begs the question of being able to do history and knowing data and having insight into what literature is. So, to go back to Paul versus James, which is one of the bases of this course here, whatever theology has decided, whatever Rome thinks, whatever the Syriac Church thinks, whatever the Greek Orthodox might think, the fact of the matter is that a reasonable, rational person looking at this period will ultimately have to admit that James must know more about Jesus than Paul did. If James is who they say he was, and I assume that he was. But you see, James is basically written out of early Christian history in the book of Acts. So to my mind, the book of Acts is a key document in that it writes James out. But here in Eusebius, he hasn't been written out yet, because Eusebius, you say, why has he done this? I don't think he just is interested, so he keeps this material. He doesn't understand what he's giving us here. And he provides us with data that's often orthodox, but often isn't. So it's just interesting to see. Well, leave that as it may. The point is that in the 40s of the first century, Christianity and Judaism were not different. As far as Romans were concerned, Jews were responsible for what was going on. And the Christian idea of Christus is obviously Christ. That this Christus or Christ is a subversive thing that's developing, dangerous to Rome. And therefore Claudius, who's a fairly congenial ruler and benign in many ways, expels the Jews from Rome for this propaganda. And he says this picks up with something in Acts where Paul meets Aquila and Priscilla. Now, even in Judaism, he met them in Ephesus according to Acts. He says that's the reason they were there. Now, even in Judaism, Aquila is an important person. In fact, the Babylonian translation of the Bible is called in Judaism the Targum Onkelos. The Targum Onkelos. And Onkelos is Aramaic for Aquila. That's how crazy these languages move. So the Babylonian, and so Aquila is credited with the Jewish translation of the Bible into Aramaic or Syriac. It's really weird, this Targum Onkelos, which I'm not a great expert in, but I know that Aquila is the one that it is. He's called in Hebrew and Aramaic Onkelos. In Latin and Greek, he's Aquila. So even there, he's not a Christian as far as the Jews are concerned. Now, as far as Paul and Acts, he is a Christian. So, again, let's make a last statement about this. The Jews are expelled from Rome in the 40s for some unknown reason, because they're making propaganda. I think Christus is not yet Jesus Christ as the literature now presents him that we are familiar with. At this point, it's just they're making messianic propaganda. That's what I think that statement says. Not that they know all about Christ as we know him now through the hindsight of Pauline theology of the 50s and the 60s, and then the Gospels that have been written somewhere between the 60s and the 120s. So that Christ may not be what the Roman historian is speaking of. But in the 40s, I think Jewish messianic propaganda. They're making propaganda. Now, if you take the Dead Sea Scroll literature, this is very aggressive messianic literature. extremely aggressive and anti-foreign and would be kind of frightening to Romans, I think. I think the Gospels are more benign, not as frightening. Okay, Claudius. This is after the assassination of Caligula. I think Claudius, we said, took over what date? 45, it's in the back of the James, there to 56 or something like that. Anyway, when he held the government, he was the next one. There was a disturbance at Passover, and Josephus does record that there was but Josephus gives us a bigger picture of it, that a Roman centurion was on the arcade of the temple, because Passover was one of the 3 national festivals that people came up to Jerusalem, that there are crowds of people there, just like Jesus comes up at Passover, or everything seems to happen at Passover. And the Roman centurion on the arcade of the temple, what did he do, Noel?
He let out a sound that was worse than his demeanor.
And he also lifted up his skirt and
oh yeah,
he lifted up his skirt and obviously showed his sexual parts to the crowd, show his contempt. Probably, I don't want to be crude about this, probably to show his uncircumcision to them, to heap abuse on their idea that you needed to be circumcised to be in this area. And then turned around and blew a fart at them. Now, where do we know that from? Josephus. Do you accept that, Professor Eisenman, and you don't accept that Jesus ascended to heaven? Yeah, because to me that's what brutal, nasty, creepy people do, you know, and that's to me the really what happens. And if that did happen, someone recorded it, that's the impression it would have made. Anyway, so infuriated the crowd that they went crazy in this particular festival. They trampled each other. You know, we get stampedes at Mecca all the time now when there are these pilgrimages, and people are always getting killed in stampedes. And Josephus says at one point in the Antiquities, I think he says 300 people were killed. In the war, he said 3,000 people were killed, or vice versa. Anyway, he's added a zero somewhere. 300 sounds more like it than 3,000. But then there was a lot of trouble in the countryside, a lot of rioting and you know, a lot of banditry that picked up from there, from the stampede in the temple. And then the Romans crucified a lot of people as a result of that. So, yeah, that's from the war, that is. Or is this from the Antiquities? I don't know. Yeah. The other one, he says 300,000. But he's picked up, oh, this is all from Josephus.